And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. It's great to have someone who I have followed probably even before whenever she got arrested a year ago, and that is Bernice Beaufort. Bernie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. And we see you on many different programs, giving your thoughts on a whole range of the decimation of British culture, mass immigration, and I want to get all your thoughts on that. But it's a year now since since you were arrested with those demonstrations that boiled over to more violent demonstrations. Some places, many were completely peaceful. Maybe. I mean, you were known before, weren't you? It's sometimes difficult to remember back because so much happens. But you were kind of very on social media. You were someone that the people followed, but then you've had issues with your ex account and all of that. Give us a little bit of kind of that background before we get on to being arrested.
Um, I in my real life am a business person, and I've worked in business for my entire career. And I kind of dabbled a little bit on X, Twitter as it was then. Um, And then my business was approached by an SEO company, and they kind of went on about how brilliant they were and how they could make your brand massive on Twitter. And I had a look at their following. They had about 1,000 people, and I thought, well, you look a bit crap. So I'm going to see what you're talking about using all these buzzwords. So I'll have a go. And I had a go, and I found that I had a space to speak. And at the time we were going through Brexit, I didn't tell anyone what I had voted for. I was just able to answer all sides of the debate. And that was really, I think, where I found a home, because I was never rude. I didn't troll anyone. I was over the subject. And so I could answer the questions truthfully. I then did the same thing in COVID. But of course, during COVID, what we didn't understand at the time, and certainly it dawned on a lot of us as we were going through the lockdown process, was that the government was tracking our every move. And people were talking about the 77th this and the 77th that, run by Tobias Elwood. And I thought that was a little bit of a conspiracy thing, until I was told to go and get my information from the government. And I received, after about a month, 38 pages of all of the things they hadn't liked that I'd said. Things like, if you've been vaccinated, then why are you at risk from someone who hasn't been vaccinated? Right. These, to me, as a business person, are completely logical questions. Anyway, the government didn't think I was very logical, right? And they didn't like what I was saying. And I was suspended for about 8 hours on Twitter, which caused a massive furore. And they brought me back. And then I was going through some business transactions the following year. This is why I lost my account, actually. I was going through some business transactions and decided to just pause the account. You know, you can deactivate for a while. And for whatever reason, when I went back in to activate the account, it had gone. The entire thing had gone, which was really annoying. So I just started again, basically. So this account now on Exit only has about 105,000 followers. So a smaller account now. But leading up to the arrest...
Sorry, tell me about getting information on yourself. Tell us about kind of how you did that, and then maybe the surprise at everything that was recorded about you.
Well, you can write to a government department, and the name has gone completely out of my head. But basically, you write to them and you say, "I want to see all of the information you hold on me under GDPR and all sorts of legislative reasons. They have to share what they hold on you." And they emailed me back to say they couldn't do that until I provided ID. Fine. So I did. Proof of where I lived and a driving license. And then a month later, They sent me an email with a password so that I could access what they'd held about me. And literally, it was 38 pages of previous posts I had made. Now, I only had a Twitter account. If you're one of those people that is very active on Facebook, for example, and Instagram and Twitter, it would have run to hundreds of pages. And they were just all the posts that the government didn't like, or this shadowy part of the government didn't like. And so I knew then that this was happening. But don't forget, I'm a business person. I'm not likely to be spitting out things that I can't at least verify somewhere, she says, even though she was arrested. Anyway, generally speaking, I would check statistics. I'd find the source. I'd make sure, obviously, since the arrest, I probably spend 3 or 4 times the amount of time I did verifying sources. And when you're speaking on hot topics, it is easy to get carried away with the amount you're putting up, where you're finding the information. And I see people do that all the time. And now, as you watch the pincer movement coming in the UK, because of course it isn't just the online harms bill, because that runs in parallel with other legislation that's coming through, the police and crime bill, for example, the electronic data bill. All of these things are a pincer movement on what you can say and what you can't say. And I would tell you right now that the laws today are far, far, far more frightening than they were even when I was arrested. So in a year, a huge amount has changed with regard to what you can say, how you can say it, and who you can say it about. And I just don't think people are aware. In fact, I see them every single day on X. And sometimes I have my head in my hands because I know how much danger they're in.
No, exactly. And I've seen, I remember one meme I saw, and the meme was about Islam as place in the UK and saying like 30 mayors in the UK are Muslim. And then you go and you think, actually, that's not true. No, there are some. Some of them are ceremonial, some are elected. But you kind of think, oh, I'm going to reap. Oh, no, let me just check. Let me just go and double check. And then you realize it's nonsense. But you're right. It's easy to get sucked in to a narrative. And you want to be first. You also want to be accurate, but I think being first sometimes trumps accuracy.
I think for a lot of people it does. But what you just say then about that meme, you want to double check it before you send it. I would say to you, don't send it, because the laws you now fall under that you could have broken just by that meme are enough to have you arrested. If somebody complains, if somebody was to phone the police and say, I'm really offended and distressed by what Peter has just put out, that is enough for the police to turn up at your door. That wasn't the case a year ago. A year ago, when I was arrested, that was hundreds and hundreds of left-wing accounts desperate for a scalp, and that kind of played into the government's hands. But now it doesn't have to be hundreds; just one person. Look at a teacher who's been fired for saying he didn't agree with Lucy Connolly's prison sentence. One person in his union complained about him, and he was fired.
Yeah, no, it's lawfare that we're seeing across the board. Take us to that time when these demonstrations after the Southport killings of those three girls, a lot of anger that kind of linked to frustration on mass immigration, and then many of us were posting information. You put up a tweet, and what kind of happens next? How long was it since from when you put the post up to actually um, being visited, and yeah, how did that work?
So, it is quite a tragic story, actually, and I have spoken about it before. particularly in detail on Alison Pearson's podcast with Liam Halligan. That day, I had briefly seen the news. I wasn't in work that day. I had a very, very sick daughter. Not that this is an excuse, but I'm just trying to set the scene really for what happened. And I'd seen the news, but I'd also at the time been massively interested in the huge increase in mental health issues in the UK. And I'd already done some analysis that in the 1980s, we had something like 280,000 mental health beds in the UK. Last year, we only had 17,000, but our population had increased by 10 million. And so I'd been working on something I was going to write or some posts I was going to make in that vein, that we need to stop blaming mental health and saying, oh, it's a mental health issue, when we're really not doing anything about it. And I had just scrolled through my phone and I'd put in Southport and everything just started coming up. And I saw the name and a sentence saying this person, an asylum seeker, and that they had been under mental health services. And I copied and pasted it. I took a photograph of the image, which was a guy who had been on LinkedIn saying one of his daughters should have attended that dance class that morning. I put the two together, I sent the post, and I went back outside. About 4 or 5 hours later, I came back, picked up my phone, and saw it had had about 5,000 retweets. And I knew it was wrong. Because if a tweet picks up like that, then you've either done something brilliant or you've been first. And I knew I hadn't checked that information properly. So I didn't read any of the replies. I didn't look at who'd I just deleted it. But I knew I had a photograph because that's where I'd taken the image from. A bit later that evening, there was a big concerted effort by a lot of left-wing accounts saying I'd caused these riots. Well, this was insane to me because what I'd done was I was trying to talk about, if you blame this on mental health again, there will be trouble, right? So I knew that had never been my intent, but I also knew that that was the intent of the people obviously trying to create this swell around me. And I answered a few posts saying, no, I just copied and pasted. By the morning, a misinformation expert based in Qatar, funded by George Soros's foundation, all on the website, had done this deep dive and pinpointed me as the source of where the misinformation had come from. Now, that misinformation expert was followed by people with very large accounts on the left, and they started reposting this. So I went straight to this expert and I said, right, that's not the case because I copied and pasted it. And he said, prove it. And I said, hold on a minute. You're the misinformation expert with all your genius software. You know I wasn't. And anyway, he was a little bit vile. I hope the police enjoyed his answers. And I was really then in a state of a bit of panic. But I still thought it would blow over because I was a reasonable person. I'd explained that it was an accident. I'd apologized. I said I'd done something without checking. And I thought that it might blow over. Anyway, it didn't. It was all over Channel 4. I was all over the press. And as soon as that happened, I knew my career was in the toilet. At that point. And, you know, I'm I'm a person who runs other people's businesses. I run my own businesses. And you live on your reputation, right? People invest in you because they know you are trustworthy. And when you're all over the news as being the person who made up something, what nutter would make something up, right? Anyway, I contacted a data expert I knew in Australia, and he said he'd help me. And then one of my followers from nowhere just messaged me and said, "You look like you need some help." And I said, "Well, unless you're a data expert, you can't help me." And he said, "You're in luck."
Wow.
And for 48 hours, I don't think either of those two people slept. I mean, literally, they found servers all over the world. That name and that sentence had been printed on servers 4 hours before I had picked it up. So I now had proof I hadn't done it. I hadn't made anything up. I certainly hadn't done anything maliciously. And that, as Keir Starmer said many times, if you make a mistake and you apologize, then it's fine. Anyway, it wasn't, because the following day, now during this time, I was just bombarded by the press. They were in my garden. People were turning up. It was absolutely horrifying, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody, because it didn't matter what I said. They called me a liar. And then one morning, I think it was the 5th of August. Yes, it was the 5th of August. A welfare officer called up to the house to check on me, see if I was okay. I was not okay. I mean, I really was not okay. And he went away. And 2 hours later, knowing I was not okay, they sent 4 police vehicles and a paddy wagon. The police came in the house. I knew that they were going to talk to me, but a voluntary interview would have been fine, because, of course, I had all the information. I had all the proof. I had all the information, and I could have shown them where it had come from. But they didn't care about that. So they searched me, walking through my house, and then took me to the police station. And I've explained this to people before, but unless you're in that situation, you really don't know how you would behave. I always thought that I'd be really brave and I'd be able to stand my ground. And I wasn't, because I hadn't done it. I had not done it. And so to me, it was half of my brain completely shut down, and the other half turned into like Jack Reacher. So every single detail was in very sharp focus, because I thought, I need to remember this. Things like that you don't know, things like you can't drown yourself in the toilet because there's no water in it. And so the button to flush the toilet is up on the wall, which means you can't stretch your head into the loo and things that you wouldn't think about. They wouldn't let me have a hairband for my hair. I had disposable contact lenses. They didn't care. And they literally kept me for 36 hours. Now, I've subsequently learned that in my lawyer's entire experience of working in London with all sorts of criminals, only terrorists and murderers are held for 36 hours. And they held me because they couldn't find what they wanted to find. It wasn't there because it didn't exist. I had no extremist groups on WhatsApp. I had no notes where I'd made up a name. I hadn't Googled, think of a name. None of that had happened. Exactly what I said had happened had happened. And do you know what the other absolutely disgusting thing about all this is? About probably 6 months ago, so 6 months after it happened, I decided to go through the posts at the time. So I did a rebuttal post to that misinformation expert showing where he was wrong, because I knew that would prove me innocent, right? Um, and I went back to that post to have a look what people had said at the time. You should never read things about yourself, right? But anyway, for whatever reason, I did. And 3 posts down, I hadn't even needed data experts, because 3 posts down was the proof. One person said to me, I thought you might need the receipts. And he printed the archive of who'd sent the post originally, where it had come from, and when it had come. So it was there all the time. The police and the misinformation expert that decided I'd done it could have found that easy. And none of it had needed to happen, but it did. And then they put me on bail for 5 weeks, and extraordinarily, my bail conditions included that I could not engage in social media at all. So my question at the police station at 4 o'clock in the morning was, what do you mean by this? Because you haven't defined it. Do you mean texting? Do you mean WhatsApp? What do you mean? And they just said, you cannot engage in social media. So because it was undefined, and because in business, you define things very clearly, I had to understand from that they meant anything. So I had to be completely silent. I couldn't tell people what had happened in case I was rearrested. And that is the tragic story of a year ago.
Download the Getter app right now. It's totally free. It's where I put up exclusively all of my content 24 hours a day. You want to know what Steve Bannon's thinking? Go to Getter.
So don't wait. Download the Getter app now.
Sign up for free and be part of the movement.
So tell me, because you were, I remember, all over the media, you had big voices of support, you had voices of criticism, and then going through that, you were a member of Free Speech Union, and the FSU had put out information, and they had worked with you. Do you want to let us know what that's like? Because the FSU are fairly unique in the UK. I don't think there's another organization really like it. So give us a little bit of how that transpired, and how they helped you and were with you during that process.
Well, I don't really know because, of course, I don't know firsthand because I wasn't there. I was in a prison cell. But when the police, who has a criminal lawyer? Do you have a criminal lawyer? Do you know where to get one? What do you do? Google criminal lawyers in Chester? I don't know what you do.
Yellow Pages.
But as I was being arrested, I knew that they would take my phone. And I went onto WhatsApp, and I had been talking to a friend when they'd knocked on the door again. And I showed the phone to my husband and said, contact him, he'll help. And it just so happens that the person I'd been speaking to is very, very well known and helped immediately. So, within half an hour, my husband had a barrister on the phone who said, I can't, this is not my area, but this is the best criminal lawyer I know. And so my husband phoned him immediately. And then in that time, Toby called my husband. So within these little pockets and little groups of friends that you have.
And Toby Young, for those US viewers watching this, he set up Free Speech Union and is now a peer. It's now Lord Toby, I believe, in the House of Lords.
Now Lord Toby, yes. And he phoned my husband and just basically said, you do know she's a member of the Free Speech Union. We will do absolutely everything. So they worked really with my criminal lawyer, or my criminal lawyer worked with them just to make sure all the information was completely the same. But the amazing thing about the Free Speech Union, and I would encourage everybody in the country, everybody, to join up Because the amazing thing was, when I was released, they had decided that I would not be okay. And they provide psychologists, psychotherapists to get in touch with you immediately. You know, I know that Lucy Connolly has been invited to Parliament. She won't be able to do that, right? Because the experience is so just enveloping and devastating. She will need time. And that organization, the Free Speech Organization, is absolutely remarkable. So they have psychological support, legal support, they have all sorts of experts, and they are such a lovely team because they're totally partisan. They don't actually care what you've said, just that you have the right to speak and be treated fairly for doing so. They really were fantastic.
Tell me this, one of the little quotes from one of their articles, and the article is FSU member Bernadette Beaufort has case dropped after arrest for Southport killer tweet. And they say, well, you may inadvertently have spread misinformation during a time of heightened community tension. It would have been hard for the CPS to charge her with Section 179, false communications created by the Online Safety Act, which this is the big problem we have, because one of the tests has to be met that the message conveys information the person knew to be false. And I guess is that this is not, we talked about at the beginning of causing offense, and we now have all the legislation that if someone somewhere possibly may be offended, then you're now liable and you can be punished. But this was a separate part. This was in terms of information you put out that I guess the courts then have to decide, or the police read it and they decide. I mean, how does it work out? Is it that a police officer looks at it and then they decide, I think this is misinformation, and that is enough? How does kind of this understanding of what is information, what is misinformation actually work?
Well, they wanted to charge me with 2 charges. So it wasn't only that one, but they also decided that it was spreading racial communications or racist communications because I had used the term asylum seeker, which was a factual. It had, had the statement that I had copied and pasted been true, then they still wanted to charge for spreading racist communications, even though it would have been a fact. And look, it might surprise some of your viewers to hear this, and perhaps I do feel differently today, but at the time, I had a huge is too big a word, but I had a measure of sympathy and certainly understanding for the police. Because if you have huge civil unrest all over the country, they need to control that before it gets very violent and very out of hand. So on one level, I can absolutely understand why putting the terror of God into the population is the easiest way of suppressing violent civil disobedience or riots. Today, however, I have a slightly different take on it, and that's that, and I'm not a free speech absolutist. I am a freedom of information absolutist. If you do not trust the people with the truth, then when the truth outs, they will be very angry, right? So you are always better just to tell the truth. Deal with the problem. Don't deal with the reaction to the problem. And I think that's a big problem in the UK right now. So instead of dealing with the actual problems that the public has on any measure of things, the economy, pensions, illegal immigration, housing, instead of dealing with those and telling the truth, they're bringing all these laws to stop you talking about it because they think if they can suppress that, you'll shut up and you'll go and talk about something else. And that is exactly what we're facing. So on those types of charges now, under those new legislations, the Online Harms Bill, Police and Crime Bill, etc., to start with, it will be a police officer who makes the decision. But then it has to go to the CPS for the CPS to determine if there will be enough evidence to charge this person. Now, they might decide, well, we don't think we've got quite enough evidence, but it would be in the public interest to charge this person because we can terrify them some more, which is what I think they had wanted to do with me. But the post didn't come close to the bar for either of the charges. They should never have arrested me to start with. It should have been a voluntary interview where I could have shown them what happened.
Tell me, the Online Safety Act or Online Harms Bill or whatever, I mean, you can't argue with a bill that's called safety, and especially whenever it's framed in terms of children. But that has been legislation since, I think, October 2023, so nearly 2 years. I think part of the problem, it's a huge bill. It's about 350 pages or something like that. And that brings its own problems. But I think in the UK, you only know how a bill is going to be worked out when you see the police in courts, and they kind of put onto it. And you talked about some of the legislation or laws being so wide open that actually it gives the police and the courts absolute leeway to do whatever they want. None of it's tight. Tell us a little bit more. This, whenever you're arrested, it was Labour government just came into power. You've had the Online Safety Bill came in by the Conservatives. So this is a plague on both houses. The Conservative Party being utterly silent with the hundreds and hundreds of people that were jailed. Wasn't a peep from them. Tell us the legislation, because this piece of legislation, obviously copied by Europe, but it's been a focus from those in the US by the Trump administration concern of where we are going in terms of free speech. So
Yes.
what's your assessment of the last 2 years, and
So-
how is this a warning to the US viewers?
Well, I have two things I'd like to say on this. The first is that what most people don't understand is the all-encompassing power that Ofcom now has, because that act isn't complete. What we have in the UK are quangos, and these were set up in 2010 under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. What it was supposed to do was make the running of government smoother. What it actually did was it gave immense power to unelected bodies, and Ofcom is one of those. So Ofcom, under that act, can change any rule they want. They can add any rule they want. They can decide what is harmful content. They can decide what are harmful words. And there is no scrutiny from Parliament. No MP can do anything about it. So the public didn't vote for this. The MPs never will vote again. And if you look at some of the new rules they want to bring in, this will mean that, and they are looking at it in Ireland, aren't they? In fact, they're trying to bring this through now. Let me remember what it's called. I do know this, but I keep forgetting it. It's called client-side scanning. So the final chink in their control is this. What it means is WhatsApp, Signal, and all the other platforms are refusing to hand over encryption, right? They're refusing to give a backdoor. So this client side means that information will be handed to authorities as you type it on your phone before you press send, right? This is an unbelievable infringement of your privacy, an unbelievable infringement on privacy. And my other point is, in November, I still didn't really travel much on my own because I was quite frightened of going out in public on my own, because I just didn't really want people to recognize me. It was terrible. But I was invited by Lord Young and a House committee from the US, the legislative committee, to discuss in particular free speech. And I went down to London and went into this huge meeting room with, 30 or 40 people, lawyers, attorneys from the States, assistants to diplomats. It was a very senior meeting. And they were open-mouthed, absolutely open-mouthed, because they could see similarities in what Biden was attempting to do over in America. They'd just been, for example, to Brussels, and they'd met their German counterparts. Then they were coming to the UK, then they were going to Ireland. And they said that they'd met some very charming people in Germany, very professional. And they basically said that free speech would, of course, exist, but only the speech that they wanted. And they'd said it with smiles on their faces, and they were very charming. The Americans were absolutely horrified. Like, you can't, don't you understand what you're saying? And no, they didn't understand what they were saying. And I think we've reached that point in the UK that these unelected bodies, and I'm really, really serious, that unelected people should hold no sway over governments at all. These people believe that if they can shut you up and they can control language, we'll all be happy and harmonious. And that's what they plan to do.
And it's I think a number of quangos fit under government departments, I think. Ofcom, I've looked, and it was created by the Communications Act, but it doesn't seem to fit under when I've looked at it. And it's hugely concerning because it means the government can always say it's independent, nothing to do with us. So they don't take responsibility.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Completely independent, like the Bank of England. It can arbitrarily decide to do whatever it wants. So, for example, on the BBC, it has a fantastic educational website that I used with my children when they were very young, called Bite Size. It used to be fairly balanced, and a few years ago, I looked at it. I was looking at some climate stuff that they were teaching in schools, and they had this great page on global warming. On one side were all the negatives, and on the other side were all the positives. What a 1.5% rise in temperature would do for the UK. And there were really positive points. And I thought, that's a good balance. And it was taken down. They weren't allowed to show the positives, because in showing the positives, what you do is you give people a chance to argue and make their own mind up. And of course, Ofcom does not want that, because with the UN now coming in with their climate misinformation and disinformation rules, they now want platforms, and Ofcom will work with them on this, to stop all questioning of any net zero or climate narrative. So, of course, the BBC has to remove anything positive. And I think again, how can you have a body that is so powerful that it works with the UN to implement laws in this country that no MP will ever know is being passed?
Ofcom the communications regulator, they've always been overseeing newspapers or TV, so it's print media and TV. Now you have had at some point the Wild West, the internet, and that's now coming under the same. So is this that Bernie is held accountable just like someone reading the news on the BBC or the front page story in the Daily Mail? Are you then, or anyone who puts anything online, is it the same level?
No. And this is this is appalling. So you would think, wouldn't you, that mainstream media professional organizations would be held to a higher standard because they should know what they're doing, right? And people like me and you are given dispensation for just being a bit stupid, right? They didn't mean to do it. Sorry, it was a bit of a screw up. Slap on the wrist. Please try not to do that again, which probably would be enough for 99% of the population, right? No, it's completely opposite to that. All of those organizations are completely protected. So if the BBC puts out misinformation or what turns out to be harmful disinformation, they can just delete it. If you or I do, we are held to much higher standards. So we can get into trouble from the police. Now, you then have to ask yourself the question, what happens if, I don't know, I'll pick someone, the Daily Mail. Sorry, Daily Mail, I'm not picking on you purposely, but let's just use you as an example. Let's say they put out incorrect information. They put out disinformation. Now, disinformation is probably a bit harsh. Let's say they put out misinformation. They didn't know it wasn't completely accurate. And if you repost that with a comment, you can get into more trouble than they can as an individual person. Well, that's chilling, absolutely chilling. The population doesn't know what they can say and what they can't say. They don't know, for example, that if they pick on a particular CEO, let's say you're picking on a CEO of, I don't know, BP, because you don't like their oil exploration, and you do it 3 times, he can take you to court for harassment. And a judge, without a jury, can issue a restriction on you so that you cannot use the internet. There's no jury, there's no trial. It's just because he had more money than you. And that's literally what we're faced with now.
I want to just end off on another story linked to this, which we've been aware of now the last 10 days. That's this new information unit that will monitor what people say in terms of migration. And if there's a thought that could lead to something else, then they will act. And it's full on Minority Report. And I think the US viewers may not really be aware how bad it is. And this is kind of falls on from non-crime hate incidents, where if you do something that's not a crime, you can still be monitored and followed. But it's this new unit that is there simply to check what we are thinking online in terms of immigration. And I don't know if the government have, next it'll be you get a leaflet through the door and say, this is what you can say, this is what you can't. But it's so wide, it's anything they think may lead to something negative. And yeah, I think it was 10 days ago or so that information came out.
I don't think that's a new division. I think that division has always been there. I think they've just added the word to it. Yeah, I think that is the group that checked during COVID and lockdown. That was the group that was in permanent contact with Twitter, having accounts removed. I don't think that group was ever disbanded. I don't think that unit was ever disbanded. I think it's been added to. And what the government, look, like I said to you when we started this, I thought that was a conspiracy theory until I got my own my own pile of papers. I think the government has decided that since we all know, they might as well out it. And they're saying, and also now we're watching for this. So it's a warning to the British public. Don't say negative things about these topics because we have ways of silencing you. And that is very chilling. And you know what? If they did drop a leaflet through your door telling you what you could and you couldn't say, that would actually be fairer. Because right now, nobody has any idea what they can say and what they can't say. I mean, what about satire? You know, half of US programs in the evening couldn't be shown here in the UK because satire is also covered. So sarcasm.
Yeah, no, everything is. Um, the last point, kind of connecting this back to the US, you said you'd met with a delegation. I've seen lots of reports of the Trump administration concerned what's happening. Of course, in some of those press conferences, Keir Starmer looked so pathetic and weak as he said, "No, no, we've had free speech forever," and Trump is, I think. Bev Turner asked Trump some things at certain points. He was in, really, really, is that the case? Really?
Yeah.
Um, so, how does the US help in this? And because again, there are US companies that could be liable to huge fines. So it is a concern for them, probably on the economic side as well as on the free speech. So how do the kind of US fit into helping us and making sure this doesn't come back and attack them?
Um, when Trump said to Bev, really, really, I think that is just how Trump plays this game. He already knows all of this. And so does JD Vance. They have known this since before he came into power. Because I met that delegation and I know he knew all of this information. I think that's just how he plays this. And the US can do a lot. It's whether or not they want to. You've seen how appalling Keir Starmer is in negotiations anyway. Someone says, I want this, and he says, okay. So I think the problem US companies have is this jurisdiction issue. And the Britain looking to extradite anyone from the UK for what they say online, I think would be a joke. It's really going to depend, isn't it? How much Trump does actually care. I don't know. I'm not behind those negotiating walls, but we know that JD Vance did say without free speech, there'll be no free trade. So let's see, because the only people that can save what's left of the UK probably is the US, and I don't even know if they want to.
Oh, let's leave it on that, Bernie. It's fascinating to have you on and to actually just talk to you face to face. Your story, well known to the Brits, and is a warning to where we are going. So, thanks so much for joining us today and giving us your time.
Thank you for having me.